In the early hours of June 7, 1944, the Kremlin was quiet, but the war never slept. Deep inside the Soviet leadership complex, telegraph machines continued to deliver reports from across Europe. Every message could carry news capable of changing the course of the war. One such telegram arrived from the Soviet embassy in London. It was marked urgent. The message was brief but historic. Allied forces had successfully landed in Normandy and secured several positions along the French coast. The invasion of Western Europe had begun. The report was delivered directly to Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. By this stage of the war, Stalin was used to working late into the night, studying military reports and tracking the movement of armies across large maps that covered the walls of his office. When he read the telegram, he reacted calmly. Stalin rarely showed emotion when receiving important news. Instead, he quietly reread the message, weighing its meaning. For nearly 3 years, the Soviet Union had been fighting the main war against Nazi Germany. Since the German invasion in 1941, known as Operation Barbarossa, the Eastern Front had become the largest battlefield in history. Entire regions had been devastated. Millions of soldiers and civilians had died. The Red Army had fought desperately to defend Moscow and later achieved major victories at Battle of Stalingrad and Battle of Kursk. Those victories marked the moment when the tide of war began to turn against Germany. But even after these defeats, the majority of German forces were still fighting in the East against the Soviet Union. For years, Stalin had demanded that the Western Allies open a second front in Europe. He repeatedly pressed leaders like Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt to launch a large invasion of France that would force Germany to divide its army. Now that moment had finally arrived. The Allied invasion, known as Operation Overlord, had begun on June 6th. Thousands of ships had crossed the English Channel, carrying soldiers from the United States, Britain, Canada, and other Allied nations. Airborne troops had landed behind German lines during the night, while amphibious forces stormed several beaches along the Normandy coast. The fighting was intense, and the first waves of soldiers faced heavy fire from German defenses. Yet, despite the losses, the Allies had managed to establish several beachheads. Still, Stalin understood that the invasion's success was far from guaranteed. German forces would soon launch powerful counterattacks. If they managed to crush the beachheads quickly, the invasion might still collapse. Everything depended on whether the Allies could bring in more troops, tanks, and supplies fast enough to expand their position. But if the beachheads held, Germany would finally face a true two-front war. For the Soviet Union, that could change the entire strategic situation. At that same moment, Soviet planners were preparing one of the largest offensives of the war. Massive Red Army forces were gathering for a huge attack against German positions in Belarus, an operation that would later become known as Operation Bagration. If the Red Army attacked in the east, while the Allied forces pushed inland from Normandy in the west, Germany would be under enormous pressure from both directions. But Stalin's thoughts were not limited to the battlefield alone. He also understood that the end of the war in Europe was beginning to take shape. The armies that advanced the farthest and captured the most territory would play a decisive role in shaping the future political map of Europe. Western Allied forces would likely liberate France and Western Europe. Meanwhile, the Red Army was already advancing towards Eastern Europe. A silent race across the continent had begun. As Stalin placed the telegram on his desk, he knew that the events unfolding in Normandy were more than just another battle. They marked the beginning of the final phase of the war in Europe and the beginning of a struggle that would determine who controlled the continent when the fighting finally ended. The Kremlin stirred with urgency as the news from Normandy reached Stalin. Within moments, he summoned his closest advisors. Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, NKVD Chief Lavrenti Beria, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, and other key members of the State Defense Committee. Maps were unfurled across tables, radios and telegraphs clicked in the background, and the tension in the room was palpable. Every eye was on Stalin as he prepared to hear the first detailed assessments of the Allied invasion. The telegram had been brief, but the implications were enormous. Thousands of Allied soldiers had landed on the beaches of Normandy, and several positions had been secured. German resistance was fierce, but had not yet crushed the invasion. For the first time, the Soviet leadership could see that a Western front had finally opened, as they had demanded for years. Molotov immediately began considering the political consequences. He reminded Stalin that the Second Front could shift the balance of the war in the Soviet Union's favor. If the Allies held their positions, Germany would be forced to pull divisions away from the Eastern Front, easing the pressure on the Red Army. Yet he also warned that Western intentions were always suspect. The Soviet Union had to ensure it would benefit from the chaos that would follow. Beria, quiet and watchful as always, focused on intelligence. He pressed for careful monitoring of German troop movements and communications. Any misstep by Hitler's forces could be exploited, and the NKVD would ensure that no critical information escaped the Kremlin. Zhukov and Vasilevsky turned the discussion to military strategy. They analyzed how the Red Army could accelerate its operations in the east, while the Allies fought in the west. Troop placements, supply lines, artillery positions, and armored divisions were all considered in detail. Stalin listened silently, his eyes scanning the maps, calculating every possible outcome. The room was tense, but a pattern began to emerge. A successful invasion in Normandy could create the opportunity for a massive Soviet offensive in the east. German forces, stretched thin and forced to respond to two fronts, could be crushed between the Red Army advancing westward and the Allies pushing inland from France. But the timing had to be precise. Any miscalculation could turn the opportunity into disaster. Even as the advisors debated the tactical and strategic possibilities, Stalin's mind was already moving beyond the battlefield. He was considering the future political map of Europe. Whoever occupied territory first would control governments, borders, and influence in the post-war world. The Second Front in Normandy could shape not only the immediate war, but also the decades that followed. As the meeting drew on, Stalin began issuing directives. Plans were to be reviewed, resources allocated, and preparations made for a coordinated push westward. He made it clear that every move would be calculated to maximize Soviet advantage while remaining cautious about the intentions of the Western Allies. By the end of the session, the Kremlin War Council had a clear sense of purpose. The Normandy landings were more than just a military operation. They were a signal that the final phase of the war in Europe had begun. And in the Kremlin, Stalin's mind was already racing, envisioning the moves that would secure the Soviet Union not only victory on the battlefield, but influence over the Europe that would emerge when the fighting was done.
The Normandy landings were more than just news. They were a signal that the war in Europe was entering its final and most decisive phase. For Stalin and his closest generals, the question immediately became, how could the Red Army exploit Germany's new predicament? For the first time since 1941, the German army was faced with a true two-front war. Troops that had been concentrated against the Soviet Union would now have to be pulled west to respond to the Allied invasion. Every division moved west weakened the German defense in the east, creating openings for the Red Army to strike. Maps covered the Kremlin tables, dotted with colored pins and markers. Stalin, Zhukov, and Vasilevsky traced every German unit they could track, estimating how quickly reinforcements could be moved to Normandy and how those movements would affect their positions in Belarus and Ukraine. Even small logistical details, rail lines, roads, bridges, and supply depots were critical. The generals knew that mistakes, miscommunications, or hesitation by the German high command could create opportunities for rapid advances that might never come again. Stalin listened silently as the generals discussed possible scenarios. Zhukov emphasized the need to concentrate armored divisions where the Germans were weakest, while Vasilevsky focused on timing. A simultaneous push in the east, coordinated with the Allied landings in the west, could break German lines completely. Stalin's mind, however, worked on multiple levels at once. He considered not only the immediate battlefield consequences, but also the long-term strategic implications. Germany's defeat was no longer just about reclaiming territory, it was about shaping the political future of Europe. Beria, as always, reminded the group of the importance of intelligence. German troop movements, intercepted communications, and reports from spies behind enemy lines could tip the balance. Any misstep by the German command could be exploited. Every division that moved too slowly, every supply convoy delayed, and every communication intercepted could translate into a gain for the Red Army. Stalin was particularly aware that the German high command often suffered from poor coordination and inflexible orders from Hitler himself. These human errors could be as valuable as tanks and artillery. The generals debated possible German responses. They knew Hitler's forces were proud and stubborn, but years of retreat and defeat had taken a toll. Morale was fractured in some units, and supply shortages were becoming severe. If the Allies could hold their positions on the beaches, Germany would be forced to split its forces, weakening its ability to resist in the east. This was the opportunity the Red Army had been waiting for, a chance to deliver a blow that could decide the war. Stalin's calculations went beyond troop movements. He considered rivers, bridges, and railways as instruments of power, not just geography. Securing these points meant faster advances, better supply lines, and more leverage in shaping the post-war order. Every kilometer of territory mattered, not just for military advantage, but for influence over governments, economies, and populations. The Red Army's presence in a liberated region would determine who controlled its future, regardless of what diplomats might agree in conferences later. The generals also discussed timing. The Red Army was preparing its largest summer offensive yet, aimed at destroying Army Group Center in Belarus. This would become Operation Bagration, involving millions of troops, thousands of tanks, and overwhelming artillery. If the Soviet offensive coincided with the Allied advance in the West, Germany could be trapped between two enormous forces, unable to recover. Stalin calculated the best moment to strike, ensuring that every attack would compound the pressure on the enemy. But he also considered the risks. If the Allied invasion failed, Germany could transfer forces back to the east, reinforcing the Eastern Front and threatening Soviet gains. Every movement, every logistical decision, and every calculation depended on precise timing and coordination. Stalin knew that misjudging the situation could be catastrophic. Even in this tense military planning, Stalin's thoughts turned to the larger picture. The war was not only about defeating Germany, but about shaping post-war Europe. Whoever controlled territory would control governments, borders, and influence. The Normandy landings meant that the Western Allied armies would likely advance into France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, while the Red Army pushed through Poland, the Baltics, and eventually into Germany itself. This created a race across the continent, a silent struggle to secure positions that would determine political power after the fighting ended. As the meeting in the Kremlin continued late into the night, Stalin's calculations grew sharper. He weighed each scenario, the movements of German divisions, the speed of the Allied advance, the readiness of Soviet troops, and the vulnerabilities of cities and supply lines. Every advantage had to be exploited, every weakness attacked. He knew that success depended not just on numbers and firepower, but on timing, cunning, and the ability to anticipate the enemy's mistakes. By the end of the session, a clear strategy was forming. The Red Army would accelerate its offensives in the east, targeting German positions and key transport hubs. Coordination with the Western Front would be monitored carefully, ready to exploit any pressure the Allies could place on the Germans. Stalin made it clear that every decision now carried consequences for both the military and political future of Europe. The Normandy landings had changed everything. Germany was now fighting for its survival on two fronts, and the Red Army was poised to take full advantage. But Stalin knew that the final victory would not come from a single battle. It would be the result of relentless pressure, strategic foresight, and the careful timing of every move. As the generals left the Kremlin, maps and markers returned to their places, and the quiet of the night returned. But in Stalin's mind, the war was already moving faster than ever, and the race for Europe had truly begun.
Even as the Red Army prepared to strike harder in the east, Stalin's mind turned to the Allies. The Normandy landings were a monumental achievement for the Western powers, but Stalin knew better than to take appearances at face value. He had spent years negotiating and pressuring Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt for a second front, and now that it had finally arrived, he could not help but question their true motives. In the Kremlin, he met again with his closest advisors. Maps were laid out, reports were read aloud, and Stalin listened, absorbing every word. Molotov spoke first, reminding the group that the Allies had promised a landing for years and had delayed repeatedly. "We have waited for this moment," he said, "but we must not be naive. Allies act in their own interests, not ours." Stalin nodded quietly, his face betraying nothing, but his mind raced. Beria emphasized intelligence gathering. He insisted on monitoring every Allied movement as closely as the Soviet Union watched the Germans. "Even friends can be foes," he said. Information about troop deployments, supplies, and strategic objectives could provide the Soviet Union leverage later. Stalin agreed. Knowledge was power, and the Allies might be thinking ahead, not for victory over Germany alone, but for influence in Europe after the war. Zhukov and Vasilevsky returned to military strategy, but even their conversation touched on politics. Timing, they explained, would be everything. If the Red Army could advance faster and capture key cities and transport hubs, the Soviet Union would dictate much of the post-war map. Stalin's gaze drifted over the maps, envisioning rivers, bridges, and rail lines as chess pieces. He had always believed that armies in the field were far more decisive than treaties on paper. He considered France and Western Europe, where Allied forces would advance and liberate territories that had been under German control. But Stalin's mind went further east. Poland, the Baltics, Romania, and the Balkans were all regions where Soviet influence could expand if the Red Army moved quickly. Every city captured, every railway line controlled, every river crossed would strengthen the Soviet position. The Allies could secure the West, Stalin would secure the East. Yet he remained wary. Churchill and Roosevelt were allies, but allies with their own ambitions. Stalin suspected that the Americans and British might want to limit Soviet influence in Europe once Germany fell. They might slow the Soviet advance diplomatically or even militarily if the opportunity arose. He knew that once the war ended, agreements on borders and governments could be ignored if armies controlled the territory first. The generals discussed logistics, but Stalin's mind returned repeatedly to politics. His notes detailed not just troop movements, but potential influence zones. He calculated how the Red Army could reach major German cities, secure eastern Poland, and occupy regions that could form the basis for satellite governments. Stalin believed that power in Europe would ultimately be measured not in agreements signed on paper, but in control on the ground. He also thought about the German leadership. Hitler's forces were now caught between two enormous threats, yet the Führer were named unpredictable, and Stalin knew that German desperation could delay or distort their response. The Allies might succeed or fail in Normandy, but in either case, the Red Army had to be ready to exploit weakness immediately. Time would be measured in days and hours, not weeks. Stalin's suspicion of the West was not paranoia, it was based on observation. From the beginning of the war, the Soviet Union had carried the heaviest burden against Germany. Millions of Soviet lives had been lost, while Britain and the United States were delayed in opening a second front. Stalin remembered the promises, the negotiations, and the repeated delays. Now, as the Allies finally fought in France, he had to ensure that the Soviet Union gained the maximum advantage before anyone could challenge it. He considered every scenario. What if the Allies advanced too slowly? What if they paused before pressing into Germany? What if they sought to negotiate with Berlin directly once the war ended? Stalin wanted to preempt it all. Orders were prepared to accelerate Soviet offensives in the east, secure critical infrastructure, and reach as far into Central Europe as possible. Stalin believed that the Red Army's control of territory would ultimately determine the post-war balance of power. Stalin's advisors debated the possibilities, but he made the decisions quietly. There would be no public declarations, no boasts, only calculated movements, measured advances, and strategic patience. Every river crossing, every city captured, every railway secured would be another piece in the post-war puzzle. Even as night fell over Moscow, Stalin's calculations continued. Normandy was important, but the larger war and the larger prize lay in the east. Stalin saw Europe not just as a battlefield, but a continent to be reshaped according to the Soviet Union's will. He understood that history would judge those who controlled the land when the war ended, not those who merely signed treaties. The meeting concluded, but the Kremlin remained alive with activity. Orders were sent, intelligence teams mobilized, and troop movements coordinated. The race for influence and territory had already begun, and Stalin knew that every day, every hour, and every decision could make the difference between victory and missed opportunity. For Stalin, the Normandy landings were not just a military event, they were a test of strategy, timing, and foresight. The Allies had opened a front, but the real war was as much about politics as it was about soldiers and tanks. And in the quiet halls of the Kremlin, Stalin was already thinking several steps ahead, calculating the moves that would secure Soviet power long after the last gunfire had ended.
With the Normandy landings underway and Stalin's suspicions of the West firmly in mind, the Kremlin shifted its attention to the next phase, the race across Europe. Stalin understood that the outcome of the war would not be determined solely by battles in France or Belarus. It would be decided by who controlled key cities, rivers, and transport hubs before the fighting ended. Every kilometer gained, every railway captured, every town occupied would shape the post-war political map. The Red Army was already moving westward. Troops in Belarus, Poland, and the Baltics were preparing for massive offensives designed to push the Germans back and secure as much territory as possible. Operation Bagration was just beginning, and its scale was unlike anything Germany had faced. Millions of Soviet soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery, and aircraft, were ready to strike at the heart of Army Group Center. Stalin knew that this operation, combined with the Allied pressure in Normandy, could collapse German defenses entirely. In the Kremlin, Stalin and his generals studied maps of Central Europe. Cities like Warsaw, Krakow, and Budapest were more than strategic objectives, they were symbols of control. Whoever reached these cities first would dominate the political structures that followed the end of the war.
Stalin's orders were clear: advance swiftly, secure infrastructure, and preempt any attempts by the Western Allies to influence these regions. Stalin also considered Germany itself. Berlin was the ultimate prize. Occupying the city would not only signal victory, but would determine who held the power to shape the post-war order. Every advance toward the Oder and Vistula rivers, every crossing of the Narev or Elbe, brought the Red Army closer to a decisive role in Europe's future. The faster Soviet forces moved, the less leverage the Allies would have to dictate political outcomes in Eastern Europe. The generals discussed logistics at length. Maintaining supply lines over vast distances, coordinating infantry, armor, and artillery, and anticipating German counterattacks were all critical. Stalin listened carefully, but focused on the larger picture. The combination of military speed and strategic foresight would decide not only the war, but the peace that followed. As the Red Army advanced, German forces were increasingly overstretched and demoralized. Hitler's insistence on holding territory at all costs often led to isolated units being destroyed, further weakening their ability to resist. Stalin understood that rapid, decisive offensives could exploit these weaknesses, creating a chain reaction that would hasten the collapse of German resistance in the East. Even as the Allies moved through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, Stalin kept the focus firmly on Eastern Europe. Poland, the Baltics, and the Balkans were considered essential to Soviet security and influence. Orders were issued to ensure that the Red Army would establish control over these regions before the Allies could negotiate or intervene politically. Stalin believed that military presence would outweigh diplomatic agreements. Control on the ground was the ultimate measure of power. Every victory, every liberated city, and every captured railway reinforced Stalin's broader vision. The Red Army's momentum had to be sustained without hesitation. He emphasized that coordination, intelligence, and speed were more valuable than sheer numbers. Delays could allow Germany to regroup, or worse, provide the Allies with opportunities to limit Soviet influence in Central Europe. By the time summer turned to autumn, the race for Berlin had fully begun. The Red Army advanced relentlessly, its commanders following Stalin's precise instructions. Coordination between infantry, artillery, and armor was seamless, and logistics were carefully managed to sustain the momentum. Every step westward increased the Soviet Union's bargaining power, ensuring that when the final victory came, it would come on Moscow's terms. Stalin's strategy combined military pressure with political foresight. The Red Army was not just liberating territory, it was securing influence, preempting Western ambitions, and shaping the post-war order. For him, the battlefields of Europe were also chessboards, where every move mattered, and the prize was control over the continent's future. As the Kremlin watched the reports from the front lines, it became clear that Germany was losing the war on two fronts simultaneously. The Allies had opened a Western front, but the Red Army's advances in the East were decisive. Stalin's calculated patience, foresight, and ruthless understanding of power meant that by the time Berlin fell, the Soviet Union would emerge as a dominant force in Europe. The race was not only about defeating Hitler, it was about shaping history itself. Stalin understood that the positions occupied by the Red Army would determine who ruled in post-war Europe, which governments would be installed, and how borders would be redrawn. By the time the final shots were fired, the Soviet Union would not only claim victory on the battlefield, but would also dictate the political map of Eastern Europe for decades to come.